Yesterday, the president was at the Economic Club of Washington, D.C. He praised his economic record and said that there was still more to do. He focused on inflation and the Federal Reserve's decision to start cutting interest rates. Biden said that that's a positive sign for the economy. So joining me now to discuss the president's speech are Brandon Arnold, Executive Vice President at the National Taxpayers Union, and Jim Schultz, President from the Minnesota Private Business Council. So yesterday, the president didn't talk about how the government spending more than it takes in causes inflation, but here's what he said about lowering energy costs for Americans. Take a listen.
Lower energy costs for families with tax credits, to install rooftop solar and efficient energy appliances, to weatherize your windows and doors with high-tech insulation, more efficient heating and cooling systems.
So, Brandon, let me start off with you. Let me get your first reactions to what the president said. Are subsidies like this the right way to bring down costs?
No, absolutely not. Listen, most Americans are not putting solar panels on their roof. In some parts of the country, that's not a viable option. But even if it is, it's quite expensive. Most Americans are not going out there and buying an EV for $70,000, $80,000. They don't have that money. What they're looking for is lower costs in their utility bills, whether that's natural gas or what have you. They want to see those traditional energy sources come down in price. What he's talking about might be the long-term goal of this country, might be the future of how we're getting energy, but it doesn't really dictate how we're getting our energy today. And that is why Americans are so frustrated, because energy costs have gone up, whether that's the price at the pump or the price on their utility bill, and people are frustrated about it.
Jim, do you agree? What are your thoughts? Subsidies like this, right way to bring down costs or not?
Well, you touch on really one of the fundamental errors of Biden's speech yesterday, is there's two huge elephants in the room that he failed to address. Number one, the dramatic contribution to the inflation we've seen by virtue of his administration's policies of dumping immense amount of money into the American economy when it was already overheated, driving up prices, driving up inflation. And that, of course, hurts the middle class, the working class the most, because the wealthy are insulated by their wealth and so forth. And so the reality is that Biden failed to address that fundamental reality. And then number two, he failed to address the incredible national deficit that his administration has contributed to so significantly. Both parties have failed at it, but the reality is that it's under Joe Biden that our interest is now $1 trillion each year on the national debt. That's outrageous, and he failed to address it.
So, Brandon, Biden also said that the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates, a sign of progress in the economy and economic recovery and on inflation. He highlighted the importance, of the Fed making these decisions independent of political pressure. Let me play another soundbite for you.
That independence has served the country well. And by the way, I've never once spoken to the chairman of the Fed since I became president. It will also do enormous damage to our economy if that independence is ever lost.
So here's the thing. Biden has actually met with Powell publicly in the White House. Trump weighed in on what the Fed should do while he was president, and other elected officials were publicly putting pressure on the Fed to cut rates before this week's announcement. Brandon, where do you stand on this idea of Federal Reserve independence?
Well, we do need to preserve some level of independence here. We don't want interest rate cuts to be utilized for political purposes. So we did see a large interest rate cut, which is atypical right before an election. This is the last time the Fed will meet until after the election. But in this particular instance, I think it was very much warranted. Indeed, I would have had the Federal Reserve cut interest rates months ago if I were at the steering wheel here, because I think what we've seen is such an accumulation of household debt that is really crushing for working class Americans. $18 trillion nearly in household debt. Those are mortgages, auto loans, credit cards. All of this debt is skyrocketing. And for people that are really struggling in this economy, we're seeing more and more in the way of defaults and more people heading toward bankruptcy. That's a huge problem. The interest rate cuts will help that and help spur more broad-based economic growth as well. You want to remove politics from the situation, but this was long overdue.
Jim, Trump has said before that perhaps the president should have a say in what the Fed does. What is your reaction on the Federal Reserve's independence?
Well, it is really important that the Fed does maintain a meaningful level of independence, as Brandon alluded to. You wouldn't want a situation where you've got a president who can lower interest rates immediately before an election to boost his electoral chances and things like that. But I do think a lot of Americans are concerned at this moment about the Fed. This interest rate cut in September, immediately before the election. It certainly does juice the economy at an important time, and I think a lot of Americans do have questions about that and how it would seemingly help the party in power, that is the Democrats.
Now, there was another interesting comment by the president yesterday. It tied with the debate over tariffs and protectionist economic policies. Let me play another clip.
The old playbook was to go abroad, the cheapest labor, export American jobs, import foreign products. Our new playbook is we export American products and create American jobs right here in America where they belong.
Brandon, how do you see Harris and Trump differing when it comes to allowing free trade versus building up the American industrial base?
Yeah, it's been very interesting to see Biden and Harris kind of take both sides of the tariff issue, because on one hand, they're imposing tariffs. They're doing that right now, which I think is harmful for American consumers and workers. On the other hand, they're criticizing Trump for imposing tariffs, or just this desire to move forward with large tariffs. And I think they're right about that. If Trump got his way and had these massive tariffs, 10, 20% on all incoming goods and much higher rates on Chinese goods, I think that would contribute to inflation. That would be bad for workers and consumers alike. But it's really weird to see them essentially take both sides of an issue here. At the end of the day, tariffs are taxes. We should lower taxes if we want to reduce inflation and help our economy succeed.
So yeah, Jim, potentially Trump and Harris will keep the tariffs on China and perhaps other countries as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the Republican Party has, during the course of Trump's time in the spotlight, has reassessed to ensure that free trade is also fair trade. That is, that Americans aren't being manipulated and getting trade deals that are simply unfair. So it's ultimately really important that the trade deals we strike, while fundamentally embracing free trade, that it is really important that the trade that we do enter into is fair trade. And I think that's what a lot of Americans want at this moment. I think it's really important for the economy going forward that we really focus on three things. One, the national debt, getting that under control. Two, keeping an eye on inflation, ensuring that we don't have that massive inflation. And three, getting our border under control so that we don't have these millions of folks moving across our border going forward.
So Jim, you mentioned debt. So on this issue of government debt and deficits, why is it that neither candidate is making this a major campaign issue?
Well, unfortunately, these days it's politically unpopular to talk about the really important steps we need to do to get control of our debt. And you're right, both parties, and not just at this moment, but for a couple decades, have failed to spend in accordance with the means that we have as Americans. And so we have to have both parties come to the table, have a serious conversation about what it will take to move on from this period in which we've now gained $30 trillion of debt that is such a burden on our country and our children's future and so forth. And I think people have to make some hard choices that aren't politically popular, but are necessary if our country is going to be successful well into the 21st century.
All right, Brandon, you get the last word here. President Biden said yesterday there's still more to do on the economy. What should he do before a new administration comes in next January?
Well, there's a lot that he could do. I think starting to unilaterally scale back tariffs. And I think, as Jim said, bringing people together, Republicans and Democrats alike, to have an adult conversation about our debt. Our debt problem has exploded before Biden was president, but certainly since he's been in office, we've added about $7 trillion to our national debt. That is a tax that will be imposed on future generations. It's unfair to Americans today. It's unfair to Americans down the road. And until we have a bipartisan agreement that this is an enormous problem that needs to be addressed in a meaningful way, that leadership needs to come from the White House, whether that's Biden, whether that's Harris, whether that's Trump. We need to see more leadership. And I think he can start that process today by convening Republicans and Democrats to have a grown-up conversation.
All right, Brandon, Jim, thank you very much for your time today.
Good to be with you.
Thank you.